want to welcome. I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar, and most especially our two guests. I will introduce them momentarily. I know that many people were hoping to be here, but unfortunately, we had a death in our congregation of a beloved member, Esther Lott, of blessed memory, and the funeral is overlapping a bit with this webinar. And I'd like to dedicate the webinar to Esther and her memory. She was someone who not only loved Herzl-Ner Tamid, but loved the state of Israel. And she's not here physically, but she is here more than in spirit. I'd also like to make a shout out to the whirlwind who made this webinar possible, Ayelet Shalev. We were speaking before the webinar began, or Yuval was, about Ayelet and the incredible spirit she is in galvanizing the Israeli-American community here in Seattle, or helping to do that during the protest movement, getting Yuval involved, getting me involved. And she was the brainchild behind this webinar, this gathering. And unfortunately, she can't be here, or she may try to be here, but she's in a place does not have great Wi-Fi. Does not have great Wi-Fi. So she is also here in spirit. And I want to thank my assistant Aviva Kraus for all of the legwork in making sure that this webinar got off the ground. Let me introduce our guests. I'll start first with Yossi. Yossi Klein Halevi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He is the author of many groundbreaking and well-regarded award-winning books, most especially his magnum opus, Like Dreamers, and his most recent book, A Letter to My Palestinian Neighbor. He is also my dear friend, my beloved teacher, former colleague, and I'm just so thrilled to have Yossi here with us today.
Very mutual.
Thank you. And Yuval Neeman, who is known also to many of you here in Seattle. Yuval is a managing director of Trilogy's investing team. He is a former captain in the IDF. He served in the artillery in the IDF. And as many of you know, he is a really important leader here in the Seattle area amongst the Israeli-American community, and very much a part of the unacceptable movement.
Pleasure to be here. Thank
you. You're welcome, Yuval. Great to be with you too. Now, this webinar was entitled "The Role of American Jews in Israel's Renewal." I would actually amend that, if I could, after the fact, to call this "The Role of American and American Israeli Jews in Israel's Renewal." One of the reasons why Yuval is here is because he brings a really important voice to this conversation, not merely as an American Jew, but as an American Israeli Jew. I think I've used the phrase Israeli expat in the past, and Yuval has very gently and diplomatically corrected me and others in saying, "No, I'm not an Israeli expat, but I'm an Israeli American Jew," and his voice will be really critical as we begin to discuss the role of the North American and the most specifically the American Jewish community, made up of American and Israeli Jews who consider themselves American and Israeli, as we look forward or look ahead to what will happen after this crisis and this war are over. Yossi, can I start with you? You have said many, many times vis-a-vis the Israel-Palestinian conflict that you see this as you've always seen the establishment of a Palestinian state as an existential need and an existential threat. And I'd like for you, if you could, to perhaps use that same framework in having us think about what you see as an existential need and an existential threat as we move forward past this war and what will follow in terms of rebuilding and transformation, not only of Israel, but of the region. And if you don't like that framing, please feel
Oh no, that framing, I have to own it. I have said that many times. And it's interesting to unpack that that framing in light of October 7th. Just very briefly to sum up what I meant pre-October 7th is that it is an existential need for Israel to extricate itself from ruling over another people. It is an existential need for preserving Israel as a democratic state, as a credible Jewish state. And so I believe that on the one hand, a Palestinian state is an existential need for us, leaving aside the Palestinians for a moment. On the other hand, I deeply share what I consider to be the legitimate fear of a majority of Israelis, maybe a strong majority of Israelis, especially now, for duplicating the Gaza disaster to the West Bank. The West Bank is Israel's most sensitive border. The West Bank highlands overlook the coastal plain where 70, 80% of the Israeli population lives, most of our infrastructure. And so to risk a Palestinian state that would fall into the hands of Hamas, or even Fatah, which to my mind has never come to terms with the legitimacy of the Jewish presence in this land, is in its way an existential threat. Now, October 7th has intensified Israeli fears of moving the Gaza disaster to the West Bank. I have a friend of mine who was one of the founders of the Peace Now movement, who said to me the other day, who can imagine a Palestinian state today? And I was actually shocked to hear this from him. But Haaretz ran a I don't know if you saw it, Yuval, in this last weekend. Haaretz ran a cover interview in its magazine with the outgoing head of the kibbutz movement, who basically said the kibbutz movement has to cut its ties with the left. It's the head of the kibbutz movement, and realign itself with the right. And so that gives you some idea of the understandable mood in this country. And to talk about a two-state solution today seems to most Israelis as madness. But that's one takeaway. The second takeaway, to my mind, is that October 7th also reinforced the argument that a Palestinian state is an existential need for Israel in the following way. What October 7th proves is that the Palestinian people and the Israeli people cannot live together in one dysfunctional state between the river and the sea. It's impossible. It will be Yugoslavia, but much worse. And so what October 7th also proved was that Ariel Sharon was right when the man who built the settlements in Gaza dismantled them and forced us back to the international border. And I can't say this in Israeli discourse today. And I understand people are not ready to hear it. But I do feel that we may come to the point in the coming months, when more and more Israelis will start realizing that the argument, not of peace with the Palestinians, because almost no one in Israel today believes after October 7th in the chance of peace, but the need for separation of these two peoples. And just one last comment about that, Jacob, which is that we forget that during the Oslo years, there were actually two camps that supported the Oslo process. One was Shimon Peres's camp, which spoke of peace and a new Middle East. And the other was the much more cynical and wary camp of Rabin. Rabin did not speak of peace. He spoke of separation, the need to separate these two peoples. And his campaign slogan in 1992, in the 1992 elections, was take Tel Aviv out of Gaza and Gaza out of Tel Aviv. And I think that approach could resonate among Israelis, even Israelis who justifiably regard a Palestinian state today with more wariness than ever before. But that still doesn't undermine the counter argument of why we need to separate these two peoples.
Thank you, Yossi. Yuval is as an Israeli American Jew living here in Seattle. Do you find that I'll let you speak for yourself, but if you want to opine on behalf of other members of the community here, does it sound or seem like the framing that Yossi just shared with us, or I should say the perspective about the prospects for peace as opposed to separation, does that speak to members of the community that you dwell within, that you the circles within which you find yourself?
For some, for sure. I think most of the Israelis agree with a point of separation. And then you have a whole very diverse set of opinions of what and where. But I want to add kind of a couple of things, the before October 7 and after, because another way to look at October 7 is it's unfortunately the fruition of Netanyahu's policy, which is supporting the most extreme Palestinian leadership, Hamas, and completely ignoring the more moderate Palestinian leadership in the West Bank under Abbas, with all its flaws and corruption and whatnot. And so I think we have to take that into context, in that we didn't get here just because. There was a very deliberate policy by this government, or by the leader of this government for the last 15 years, to embolden the most extreme version of Palestinian leadership, so that we can say there's no partner and there's no way we can create any separation, to use Yossi's term. Now, what happened right after October 7th was the very basic kind of need for human beings, for Israelis, was violated. That is the personal safety. Many Israelis who I speak with and I hear lost their sense of personal safety, because of what you've seen, what happened, in the kibbutzim and other places, close to Gaza. People felt threatened. People felt, you hear people now saying, oh, I want to have a gun, which you never heard in Israel for civilians. So I think you have to take those two things into perspective. The first is, we clearly have had a failed approach, and unfortunately it culminated in this terrible kind of situation we're in now. And very naturally, most Israelis right now cannot contemplate, any accommodations with the Palestinian, because they just don't feel any personal safety. And so I think we have to take those two things into perspective. I want to remind us and take us back to 50 years ago, the Yom Kippur War was, kind of probably the closest parallel, though, even though in my mind, and I was 16 years old then, so take that with a grain of salt. It was a shock, but it wasn't quite as horrific as what we had in October 7th this year. Out of that came the most strategic strengthening of Israeli security, which is the lasting peace with Egypt, cold and however you want to call it. And so nobody in the wake of the Yom Kippur War thought that we are going to have peace agreement with Egypt. I don't know if history will repeat itself or not, but I just want to put those three things in context. It's the policy that led us here, and it's the shock that Israelis are in trauma. It's plain and simple. And to some degree, I think one of the things that we as Israelis who live outside of Israel, and we as Jewish Americans or other Jewish who live outside of Israel, we can maybe actually be a little bit of a help in helping the Jewish population in Israel come out of this drama, but also think that it's not always going to feel like this. And there is got to be some way to solve this that is different than what we're seeing happening right now.
It's interesting, the argument that's been made of late, that you've just made, Yuval, about the Netanyahu government supporting Hamas and the infrastructure in Gaza, and that seemingly backfiring. I remember having a conversation with Tal Becker, who's also a senior fellow at Hartman, because I was perplexed about the reasons why Israel was providing things like electricity and other important resources to Gaza, given that Gaza was under control of Hamas. And he shared with me a really interesting perspective, which is that in order to prop up or to lend support to Mahmoud Abbas, Israel had to ensure that Gaza didn't collapse, because if Gaza collapsed, that would actually not bode well for the Palestinian Authority and for Abu Mazen. So to me, it seemed like there was, Israel was caught between a rock and a hard place. You don't want to obviously lend any kind of support, let alone material support, to a terrorist organization. But at the same time, rather than marginalizing Abbas, this was, according to Tal's analysis, this was a way by which the infrastructure of the PA, the Palestinian Authority, would remain viable. Yossi, do you have any thoughts about what Yuval shared? And
yeah, Yuval, I've used the same analogy about Sadat, but I'm not sure that it's relevant. and I will continue to use it because it's a really good analogy, but I'm not sure it's really true. And the reason for that is that our dispute with Egypt really was a border war. Our dispute with the Palestinians is an existential struggle over the same piece of land. And we're not talking about giving back a big empty piece of land. We're talking about, Judea and Samaria is for so many Israelis is the heart of the land of Israel. I feel that way too. For me, giving up Judea and Samaria would be a tragedy, a historic tragedy. I believe we have no choice because there's a counterclaimant to the land. But I don't see myself as an occupier in Judea and Samaria. I'm occupying the Palestinians, and I have to come to terms with the fact that they're on the land. But from my perspective, the land, to quote a phrase, from the river to the sea, belongs by right to the Jewish people. Now, I met today with a group of Palestinians, and I said to them, I said, for me, it's all the land of Israel. I said, but for you, it's all the land of Palestine. Haifa, Jaffa, that's Palestine. And I have no problem accepting that, because I come from the same place of it's all mine. And I said, the only way that we'll ever get to a resolution is if each side gives up something that belongs by right to them. And I said, Haifa belongs to you. That's right. But Hebron belongs to me. And so what do? We have to figure out a way of partitioning our sense of justice. It's not only partitioning the land, it's partitioning justice. But that's a much harder thing to do than the move we did with Egypt. And as things stand now, neither side sees the other in the most remote way as a legitimate partner. And, it used to be that we had a majority in Israel that supported territorial compromise. We don't anymore. That majority is gone. Now, the only way that I see restoring that majority is by appealing to security, because it's security that has destroyed that majority, security fears. That's why I come back to the Rabin approach to ending the occupation, because it seems to me that that's the only way of convincing Israelis like myself, for that matter, who believe that we need a two-state solution, but I'm terrified of it. But that language, the language of separation, speaks to me, and I think that this also, just to tie this in with the theme of our conversation, I think that this is a very important conversation for American Jews, because American Jews are still, as is the American government, in the mindset of land for peace. Forget land for peace. There's not going to be peace for a long time to come. But we can have an end to occupation. That needs to be the goal. And how to keep Israel safe in that transition. Now, given the fact that I don't believe there's any chance in the foreseeable future for peace, what kind of a Palestinian state emerges? Okay, we all talk about a demilitarized state, but how much land, how many settlements are evacuated? I think that October 7th has changed the map, literally and figuratively. It's not going to be the same map that Israelis will be talking about. Every time the Palestinians lose, at every historic juncture where the Palestinians gamble on a certain policy and against Israel and lose, the potential map of Palestine becomes smaller. That's been the pattern from 1937 to 1947 and on and on. And I think October 7th will have a similar consequence.
I want to add one historical perspective and then maybe look forward in a different way. My father, as an 18-year-old with a group of folks like in his similar age, started this kibbutz where I grew up in the northwest of Israel, Kol Yechiam. In the Independence War, it was a remote place. The only distinct thing about it, there was remains of a crusade castle.
I've been there.
And when the war broke, they were under siege for almost 6 months, lost, quite a few of their friends. They were actually using the ruins of the castle for protection. And then when the war ended, my father was called up for the IDF, and in that capacity, he and another soldier were accompanying a group of high school kids on a trip to Eilat. And they were attacked by what we call today terrorists. Back then, they were called Fidayin. The word terrorist wasn't used for that yet, maybe one of the very first one. He was very badly injured, almost lost his life, spent 6 months in a hospital. Until he died about 14 years ago, he always believed, despite the huge toll he personally paid, that we can and we should find an accommodation with the Palestinians, just as Yossi spoke about it. And, that is carried with me. I want to shift a little bit from talking about what kind of accommodation there will be between the Palestinian and Israelis, and also talk about the danger of this government that started more than a year ago, and many of us were mobilized to protest against what this government was trying to do with the judicial coup, but also with this messianic version of Judaism that has, because of the way the coalition is, and because Netanyahu is clinging to power, has a huge impact on what this government is doing. And if we think that some kind of coexistence, some kind of a Palestinian state alongside Israel is a dream pipe, well, what is their solution? They're saying, well, we're going to kick all of them out. We're going to give them money to go out. We're going to kill them. We're going to bust them. Obviously, it's completely unrealistic. And the other part of this is the kind of Judaism that they want to foster on the country of Israel, and by extension, Jews around the world, is extremely dangerous. And it's something we need to talk about as well.
I really am glad you brought that up, Yuval, because the most of my activity in the past year as part of the democracy movement was actually aimed at the diaspora and trying to break the mindset of so many diaspora Jews that you don't get involved in Israel's internal affairs. But what this government proved is that the consequences of its actions will impact on the diaspora. And you're absolutely right, Yuval, that it was Netanyahu's policy of supporting Hamas all these years, keeping Hamas lucrative, making sure that Qatar continued to send hundreds of millions of dollars. Basically, Netanyahu helped build the vast infrastructure of tunnels, which we're now fighting in. And so the policies of this government in so many ways have impacted on the diaspora. And the old model, I think this past year is a turning point, and that's relevant for our conversation in two ways. The first is that it's made clear that the diaspora must get involved in Israel's internal debates. And secondly, it also changed the dynamic between Israeli Americans and the American Jewish community. And this is something that I personally care a lot about for all kinds of reasons. One of them is that I have a daughter living just up the road from you in Vancouver. She's an Israeli Canadian, and my granddaughter is being raised with these two identities, and normalizing this dual identity is again very important for me personally, but I think it's also really important for the maturation of Israeli society and for what Israelis can contribute, Israeli Americans can contribute to the American Jewish community. And you all know better than I do that there's been a big disconnect for the most part. And it's been a tremendous loss for American Jewry. You have hundreds of thousands of Israelis in your midst who are a great source of strength potentially for the Jewish community. And I also think it's been a great loss for many Israeli Americans because the Judaism that they knew in Israel is not the Judaism that's available in America. And I really look forward to a meeting point between the Israeli experience of what I would call depth and the American Jewish experience of width, of expansion, of expansiveness. Each community is strong in a different way. In Israel, being Jewish is a very deep and consequential experience. In America, being Jewish is an expansive experience. It's not expansive in Israel. There's nothing expansive about this country. It's small, it's cramped, it's besieged. We're under the rule of the worst form of Judaism. And so in so many ways, we are constricted. But what we have is depth. And I often think of Israel and Israeli Judaism as a well. A well is very deep, it's narrow, it's dark, but at the bottom of the well, there's sweet water. And there is this tremendous depth to Israeliness. And in America, there's this sense of endless expanse and possibilities. And America has liberated Judaism. And so we need this meeting point between the depth of Israel and the expanse, the ability to breathe in America. And I see Israeli Americans and American Israelis, both communities. I see us as being a bridge, because those of us who grew up in America and became Israelis, and those who grew up in Israel and became Americans, we're the ones who know the two centers of Jewish life most intimately. And I think there's a conversation that's waiting to happen.
Yossi, you were really instrumental in changing this rabbi's perspective and approach. After, you and I and Andy went marching in Jerusalem together, which was just one of the demonstrations I was a part of, and sitting in class with you and really struggling about the issue of how the American Jewish community needed to weigh in a way that did not feel comfortable at all, but was nonetheless so critical to the future and survivability of what we call democratic Israel. Now, I came back and I gave a sermon I'd never given before. And it wasn't an easy sermon. I didn't feel good about giving it, but I knew it was an important message to share with my congregation, and got really involved in the unacceptable movement here. And who would have thought that Yuval and I and other members of the American Jewish community and religious leadership in Seattle would sit around a table with American Israelis, many of whom, despite the fact that I'm new to the community, I don't think I ever would have crossed paths with them, because our paths just were so separate. It was as if we were living in two siloed communities, and our concern and love for Israel brought us together. And I think that it actually got even stronger in the wake of October 7th. So I think
I think there are so many blessings of the democracy movement, and what you've succeeded in doing in Seattle is creating a model for the rest of the American Jewish community. And really, kol hakavod.
You were going to say something.
I want to just say that to me, of the most heartening things that happened over the last year or so. One is the protest movement in Israel and the civil society in Israel. And that protest movement became, the civil society that replaced government after October 7th. In particular, brother and sisters in arms, but not only, really replaced the government in helping first get, all the equipment that the soldiers needed, which God knows what the security, the military budget in Israel shouldn't have happened. And then taking care of the close to 200,000 Israelis who are displaced within Israel from around Gaza and from the north, and catering for all their needs, from toothbrush and toothpaste to psychological help and schools and whatnot. So I think that's such a huge this cohesion and people saying, I'm going to do whatever I can to help the country, which was very evident when I was growing up, before the 6 Day War, frankly, came back again and people got really engaged. But it started with the democratic movement where people were starting to feel that the Israel that they grew up, they believed in, they served, was under threat because of this regime. And then the other thing that was heartening, so I joined, back in January, kind of the unacceptable group here in Israel, and there were like 30 or 40 of us demonstrating, every week, in Bellevue Park. And then somewhere, I think early summer, and we were saying, okay, we need to find a way to reach out to the Jewish community as well, but we had no idea how to do it. And in fact, I think Israeli American and Jewish Americans we're like water and oil. And I think potentially the root, maybe cause, or one of the causes is, to be a Jew in America, you're typically, you want to be part of a congregation, which means also part of a synagogue. And that's kind of a central pillar of your life here. In Israel, you go to a synagogue and you're part of a congregation only if you're Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox, which I never did. I grew up in a secular kibbutz, and most of my friends and most of the people in the protest movement and the majority of Israelis are not part of a congregation. So that's kind of part where the difference starts to feel strange. And in a funny way, even though, people like me don't like anything about, not anything, but don't like the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox, kind of way of life, how they celebrate the holidays and even how they pray seem to us like that's Judaism. And my wife who's much more connected to Judaism than I am, thank God. We went to a Reform synagogue, and it felt foreign, and so anyway, all of that to say, then somewhere, a few months into the protest movement and our very small nascent activity here, all of a sudden we have people like Rabbi Jacob joining us, I think after his visit to Israel, after going to a demonstration in Israel with Yossi. And then we really started to find ways to work together with rabbis and other leaders in the community and start a dialogue that never existed before. And the next step was we did, and again, I have to give Ayala the credit, we said, well, in order for the Jewish community to better understand what is going on in Israel and why it's important to go out and protest what's going on, we brought some of the leaders of Brothers and Sisters in Arms here to Seattle, and they spoke at a synagogue and at a number of other meetings, and we also helped raise money. It was an eye-opener for them as well, because until then, they were like, okay, yeah, it's great that you guys are demonstrating in Seattle and whatever, but it was an eye-opener of how big of a potential reservoir of support and moral support and financial support and political support exists here that was just completely disconnected. And recently I've been on some calls with some of the leaders of the protest movement who are now thinking about the next steps. And they're saying one of the things that we want to do is we want to create kind of I don't know exactly what the right term, Yossi probably has a better term for it, but a blueprint for what, a modern Jewish, democratic, liberal society we want in Israel. And by the way, they're saying, and we want input from the Jews, the Jews around the world, especially American Jews, which I don't think we would have heard anything like that, beforehand. So I think there are some positive things, as fortunately often is the case. A crisis often also creates new opportunities and some bright spots. I think this is very substantial. It's a break from the past where, Rabbi Jacob and I would not be speaking to each other, and we would not be thinking together of how we can mobilize support for the things that we care about deeply. I'm very encouraged by that. And I think again, I said that earlier, some of the things I think that we could do from not being in Israel and being less traumatized by what happened in Israel is to reflect back some of these very positive things that are happening and give hope to folks in Israel.
Before we carry on with that, that's a really great segue to what I wanted to ask Yossi about, Yuval. We'll take a few minutes at the end of the webinar to respond to questions. So if you have a question, please write it in the chat. Unfortunately we probably won't get to all of them, but if you do have something that you'd like clarification about, or you're curious about vis-a-vis this discussion, please put it in the chat. Yossi, speaking about, as Yuval has articulated, this opportunity to perhaps rethink what Israel can be, should be, I know that you've kind of looked at this in three different ways, three different areas of transformation or possibilities for transformation that counterintuitively October 7th has sort of put on the table for us. Could you speak about what you see as these three areas of transformation in Israel, in the American Jewish, Israeli-American Jewish? You know, Daniel, he has this ability to rattle off all the different denominations of Judaism in rapid succession. Unfortunately, I can't do that, but I think we're talking about the American Jewish community, the American Israeli community, the Israeli-American community. Where do you see opportunities here for us to have a transformative experience that will hopefully bring us even closer together, both here in America and with Israel?
So I'll try to be as brief as possible, but there are three main areas that we should be thinking about in terms of the post-war reality. The first is internal changes in Israeli society. The second is in terms of the Palestinians, which of course we've been discussing. And the third is relations between Israel and the diaspora. We've touched on all these areas, so I'll really try to summarize. In terms of internal Israel, obviously the first order of business is elections to replace this coalition of the fanatical and the corrupt. That is really what this coalition is, in essence, the meeting point of fanaticism and corruption. And if you go back to the Second Temple period, you'll see that it was exactly that convergence of zealotry, political and religious zealotry on the one hand, and the corruption of that time of the royal family, of the priesthood. Those were the forces that destroyed Jewish sovereignty 2,000 years ago. And those are exactly the forces that have come together in this government. So the first order of business, really to save this country, is to bring this government down. Now, there's an argument in the protest movement about timing. Is this the right time now? Should we be going back to the streets while the war is still going on? And that's an ongoing argument. And you can see that numbers are growing from week to week in the streets, but they're nowhere near what they were pre-October 7th. So there's a lot of ambivalence. Post-war, there will be no ambivalence at all. I believe that we're going to see the most intense demonstrations in this country's history. More long-term, we're going to need to create mechanisms in Israeli society that will prevent one part of the population from imposing the totality of its worldview on the other part of the population. It's not enough to have a technical majority in the Knesset. And this government's majority was technical. They lost the popular vote. They got 49% of the popular vote. Yes, they have 64 out of 120 Knesset seats, but that is actually a technical consequence of our coalition politics. And so it is a legitimate government in that sense. I don't think it's spiritually legitimate, but it is not legitimate for this government to impose such a radical transformation of Israel's most basic identity and its foundational institutions in the way that it attempted to do this last year. So we need either we need to think of how we navigate our debates, whether it's through a referendum, whether it's through a serious Knesset majority. There needs to be new ground rules. That's the first. That's the first thing. In terms of Israel and the Palestinians, I would suggest that we both narrow the lens and widen it simultaneously. And by that I mean that we have three areas that we need to relate to in the Middle East. The first are the Palestinians. The second are the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, and that's a different dynamic. And the third is the region. Now, my strong sense is that in order to reach some kind of accommodation with the Palestinians, we're going to need to go through the region. And what's changed in the last few years, and we can't forget this, we can't let October 7th erase this, is that substantial parts of the Arab world began a process of normalization with Israel. It's the first time. Yuval mentioned the peace with Egypt, and it was and still remains a cold peace. Egypt was opposed to normalization. I was in Morocco last year. They've already in their approach, they've already normalized relations with us. The Saudis are looking to normalize relations. So the 70-plus year war of the Sunni world against Israel could be coming to an end. The Palestinian issue is the one obstacle, and we're going to need the help of the region. And I think we also need to be focusing very strongly on the Palestinian citizens of Israel, because October 7th was a big shock for them as well. And polls show that 70+% of Arab Israelis very strongly opposed Hamas, and so there are openings in both the region and within Israeli society that can help us with the Palestinians. The final area is the diaspora-Israel connection. And here we're going to need, there's no time to really unpack this, but just again, very briefly, we need a new relationship in which Israelis begin to respect the Judaism of the diaspora and to know the Judaism of the diaspora. And diaspora Jews begin to know something of the Hebrew culture that we've created here, the music, the language. It's time for diaspora Jews who care about their Jewishness to get serious about the Hebrew culture. And something I've been trying to do for years, and you know this, Jacob, is spread Israeli music in the American Jewish community. Israeli music is fantastic. And yet the relationship is only political, and it can't only be political. That's not a living relationship. And so what we need is a much deeper relationship of mutual respect. Israel has to change its relationship fundamentally toward American Jewry. And I think the opposite is true as well.
So, Jacob, I'd like to be maybe shorter and more concrete.
Please, Yuval, go ahead.
I want to just go back quickly to, January of last year, that me and many Israelis, American Israelis, for the first time went out and demonstrated against the government of Israel. I was opposing many of these policies forever, but that was the first time we felt that we had to go out and demonstrate against it. And then we also, I think, helped convince key members and leaders of the American Jewish community that you have the permission and the obligation to also go out and demonstrate and tell your politicians, oops, something happened, and tell your politicians what you think, even if it is a criticism of the sitting government of Israel because of the danger of this government. I want to go now very specifically to debate about when to start demonstrating and call for an election. So I want to remind everybody that consistently polls show that 80% of Israelis don't trust this government, where typically in situations of war in Israel, the US, other places, when there's a war, the population of the leaders actually goes up. So this is very clear. The second point is Netanyahu is going to prolong waiting for the war to end to call for an election. Netanyahu is not going to let this end. This is going to keep going until maybe he's forced by the US or by demonstrations. So we can't wait. And I just want to remind, Yossi talked about how we're starting to see more and more Israelis protesting. It's not nearly what it was at the peak of the judicial coup, but those demonstrations from a year ago also didn't start at 500,000 on the first Shabbat. It takes time to build that momentum. And, I think that my personal view is the time is now to start. We are here at the Unacceptable Leadership in Seattle debating this. And I think it's likely that in the coming weeks, we will also go back to demonstrate, and would love to see and would like to talk to the Jewish community about it and have them join us in that. So I want to just say that I think this is the most important thing. The Arab countries potentially moving away from the conflict, none of that will happen with Netanyahu in power and beholden to the Messianic Jews who are part of his coalition, and he's completely reliant on them to continue to be in power. So we need to change this government to see any of those things happen, and we can't wait. And the hostages, by the way, can't wait either. And it's becoming pretty clear that Netanyahu is in no rush to do a deal with Hamas to get the hostages out.
Thanks, Yuval. We have a few minutes left, and I see that the chat's being populated with questions and comments. Yossi, could you speak to I find a perception that people have that, not only in our community, but in other communities, the organized Jewish communities in other parts of the country are reticent to in any way acknowledge, the pain and suffering of the Palestinians, which when I read a federation statement, I can't help it, notice there's concern for the Palestinians, who are unfortunately the victims caught in the middle of their leadership or the Hamas leadership in Gaza. And I know that when I speak in my congregation, I express concern about innocent Palestinian life. Can you speak to this issue about when you speak out, especially here in the American Jewish community as an observer, what do you think our role should be vis-a-vis the suffering that unfortunately is felt by far too many people?
Look, the paradox of this war is that on the one hand, it's the most brutal war by far that Israel has ever fought. And on the other hand, this war enjoys the almost wall-to-wall support of Israeli Jews. The entirety of the moderate left onward, leaving aside the far left, which is very, very small. We're really looking at virtual unanimity in Jewish Israel, even though this is the most brutal war we fought. And so I think that the organized American Jewish community, the part of the American Jewish community that is deeply connected to Israel, needs to acknowledge both of these realities. On the one hand, support for this war is so normative in Israel that that I think it's certainly a challenge to American Jews to take this war, the necessity of this war, seriously. On the other hand, American Jews can do something that is very hard for us to do. And here I come back to something you said earlier, Yuval. You were talking about the fact that American Jews are less traumatized. Now, I think American Jews are traumatized by October 7th, but the level of trauma here is difficult to describe. I'll tell you one just very small anecdote that I think is fairly typical. A friend of mine was telling me she was on the checkout line the other day in a supermarket, and the woman at the cash register just started crying, just out of nowhere. She wasn't just, and everyone online just simply understood she was having an October 7th moment, or maybe she has a son in Gaza, or who knows what. There are so many reasons, and people I know, and I've experienced this too. You're going through your day, and suddenly something will hit you, and you just start to weep, and it's so immediate. It's still October 7th here, and it's going to be October 7th for a long time. So the fact that the diaspora has some emotional distance means that you can express empathy for the Palestinians in a way that's really hard for us here. And I have to keep reminding myself, I'm doing lots of media interviews, and I have to keep reminding myself to express empathy. And sometimes it's sincere, and sometimes it's difficult. And I feel frozen much of the time. I am trying to control my rage, but many Israelis are not controlling their rage. And so it's essential for the moral credibility of the pro-Israel community to express genuine empathy for Palestinian suffering, for suffering that we are causing, because I believe that for the most part, we have no choice, but we have to own that. We are causing this enormous suffering. And it's not enough for us to simply say, well, Hamas is responsible. Of course, Hamas is responsible, but so are we. Now, again, I fully support this war. But at the same time, we need to own responsibility for the anguish that we're causing.
Talking about the trauma, I know that, Yuval and other members of the Israeli-American, American-Israeli community here, even more than the rest of us who are American Jews, felt very traumatized, even more traumatized than we did in the wake of October 7th. And you just spoke about, Yossi, that October 7th moment on the grocery checkout line. How does that trauma, how does it influence or impact the ability of Israelis moving forward to talk about things like separation and trying to come up with some sort of final arrangement that's going to prevent, hopefully, these kinds of brutal, horrific, barbaric attacks from happening, and enable these two peoples to live in a way that is as free of conflict as possible?
So if I may, I think of two things. I think that there's one of the challenges of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, that each of us feels that we are the victims and we've been wronged, and ignores completely the victimization pain and how the other side were wronged. And I think, unfortunately, in that sense, There's a lot of symmetry between Israeli and Palestinians. And I think the ingredient we're missing is leadership. Leadership that can take you from a place of lost hope and despair to first see the good things that happened that we discussed that have come out of this terrible set of events, but also paint a picture that is, here's where we can go. And yes, it needs to be realistic. We're not going to talk about dream pipes and whatever, but as Yossi said, it has to be some sort of separation. Maybe there's a lot of positive things happening in the rest of the Arab world and so forth and so forth. But having leadership that is refusing the only thing they want to say is we're going to fight until we've totally won the war, which is obviously unrealistic, and doesn't give any hope or even any hint of where we're going after that imaginary goal is achieved. We're not going to get there. That's part of the despair of Israelis, the despair of this leadership that they know is not going to take us anywhere good. That's part of the despair beyond the October 7 aftermath. We need to change. We need to change this leadership. We're not going to get out of this funk without change of leadership.
Thanks, Yuval. Yossi, you're often promised the last word on the For Heaven's Sake podcast with Daniil. I'm going to make sure you now have the last word. We've already gone over a little bit our time. You have the last word.
Yeah, I want to just go back briefly to something Yuval said earlier about the need for the protest movement to reactivate now. For me, the only question is pragmatic. How will the Israeli public respond to a reactivation of the protest movement? I'm very concerned about losing the support of the soft right and of driving the soft right back into the arms of Netanyahu. And so I'm not sure whether it's wise to reactivate the movement now. But the truth is that people have restrained themselves now for 4 months. And I know I feel this way. I'm exploding within. Every day that this government is in power is I experience it as a personal assault. And so I don't blame people who can't hold themselves back anymore. And it will play out the way it plays out. And sometimes the logic of events are overtaken by the emotions on the street, and that is how change happens. And the last point really is how this is relevant to the American Jewish community. And I think we all know that the Jewish world has been permanently transformed by October 7th. We don't yet know how, but it isn't only October 7th. It's the year that preceded October 7th, and that made October 7th possible. The worst year in Israel's history culminated in the worst day in Israel's history. And there's obviously a direct link. And for months, we were warning that this government is going to bring us to a disaster. Nobody could have imagined to what extent the disaster would be. But the fact that this led us to this situation is itself not a surprise. And we need to use this moment of shattering to really begin serious conversations about who are the forces for renewal, both within the American Jewish community and within Israel, forces that may not have been in the forefront until now, and perhaps now are beginning to emerge in the forefront, both in Israel and in American Jewry, and to keep ourselves from despair. I think that's absolutely crucial, and to know that we have within us the capacity to change our reality, And I believe that I'll say something, this last word, and this may sound counterintuitive to some of you, but I'm actually more hopeful for Israel's future now than I was in this past year. When our government was declaring war against Israeli decency, and hundreds of thousands of Israelis weren't sure if they had a place anymore in Israeli society, I was worried about Israel's long-term survival. I'm not anymore. We've proven our resilience. We've proven our capacity to come together. And God willing, we will bring this government of Jewish disgrace down, and a new era will begin.
Well, on that hopeful note, I want to thank you, Yossi Klein Halevi, for being here today and sharing your insights and your hopeful message. And to you, Yuval Neeman, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you on the screen as well as in person here in Seattle. Yossi, I look forward to seeing you and being with you in Jerusalem this summer. I want to thank everybody for being here today, for being a part of this conversation. And when we next time meet, God willing, it'll be because we're celebrating not only peace, but a new transformed Israel, and one with which we Jewish Americans, Israeli Americans, American Israelis will feel a real common bond. Thank you all.
Good to be with you.
Be
Thank
well,
you.
everyone.